For decades, the wage gap between CEOs and their average worker has been growing further and further apart, from a factor of 31 to 1 in 1978 to more than 10 times that in 2019. And in that period, while the workers have seen a paltry 14% growth in pay overall, get this, their top boss has gotten a raise more than 80 times that, upwards of 1,100%. It's a trend that only gotten worse during the pandemic, including here in New England. So writes Shirley Leung in the Boston Globe. She's also a GBH contributor, and she joins me now, along with Bob Pozen, a senior lecturer at MIT's Sloan School of Management and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and the author of the new book, Remote Inc., How to Thrive at Work Wherever You Are. Wherever you two are, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Shirley, in a pretty bad year for corporate bottom lines and an equally, if not worse, bad year for the bottom lines of those workers, their workers, many of whom were laid off, what was the trend in CEO pay in large public companies here in New England?
Here in New England, we invited Equilar, which is an executive compensation data firm, to do an analysis for us of about 40 companies. And they found that the median CEO pay grew over 20%. I think you had 21.4% at a time when the median revenue fell 2.4%. So it was pretty startling finding. I think nationally you found overall median pay falling.
You know, Shirley, staying with you for a second, you went on to say that somebody you've written about before, Larry Culp, who runs GE, is perhaps the poster boy for this trend. Why'd you pick him?
Well, during a year where Larry Culp, the CEO of GE, had to lay off thousands of employees, and GE had a tough year. Remember, GE makes jet engines.
Sure.
And so air travel was crippled by the pandemic. And yet the board opted to redo his package. And so he stands to make, his new package is valued at $73 million now. Of course, he has to hurt certain targets. It meets, in the future. But still, it was an example of how in bad times you can do well. And he could potentially do better out of 2020.
You got to feed the family, Shirley. Come on. So, Bob, other than the moral among us who found this kind of thing abhorrent, this growing disparity, why should we care about this?
Well, all that money is ultimately coming out of shareholders. And as a former, president of Fidelity Management, we as institutional shareholders, we're all for pay for performance. So if things are going very well for the company and the CEO is doing a great job, we have no problem paying him or her more. The problem comes is, what happens on the downside? What if the company isn't doing well? What if the economy isn't doing well? And compensation committees are not very good about lowering CEO pay when things aren't so good.
When I said to you, why should people care? A lot of CEOs, shareholders do care. Shirley detailed a bunch of businesses, including shareholders at GE, who voted disapproval for the compensation packages. But as you and she point out, they legally have the power to do it, but it's non-binding. You think government should go one step further and give shareholders some real power?
Yeah, in Switzerland, they actually had a citizen referendum. It was like voting, the whole population voted to make those advisory recommendations binding right from the get-go. But my suggestion is a little more modest. I'm saying if you lose an advisory vote on executive comp in year one, then you ought to get the message. And then if you lose it twice in a row, well, then that compensation committee vote ought to be binding, and the committee ought to redo the comp. The way it is now, it's an important signal and a symbolic signal, but there are a few companies that don't get the message. Oracle has actually had 3 advisory votes against them in a row, and they don't seem to care very much.
Well, they may not have gotten the message, but Shirley, you mentioned a pretty high-profile messenger who, during a speech to Congress at the end of April, actually touched on this very issue. Here's President Biden.
Look, the big tax cut of 2017, it poured billions of dollars into the pockets of CEOs. In fact, the pay gap between CEOs and their workers is now among the largest in history. According to one study, CEOs make 320 times what the average worker in their corporation makes. The pandemic has only made things worse. My fellow Americans, trickle down. Trickle down economics has never worked. And it's time to grow the economy from the bottom and the middle out.
You know, Shirley, maybe trickle-down economics hasn't worked, but do trickle-down messages work? Meaning, is there any reason to think that CEOs or compensation committees on boards, Shirley, will take the president's message to heart and change their ways, or is this just background noise?
No, I do think there is real momentum right now, and in large part to the pandemic. I think the pandemic has exposed how the income inequality in this country, and it's been costly. It's cost jobs. It's cost livelihoods. I think there's real change on its way, but it will take time. I mean, you have the White House weighing in. You have shareholders weighing in on these say on pay votes. You have Senator Bernie Sanders in Congress, this tax excessive CEO pay act that's coming down the line. There's real momentum, though change, as I pointed out in my piece, it's not going to happen overnight, but you do feel new pressure this year.
Bob, speaking of Bernie Sanders, he's got a bill, the thing that Shirley just referenced. If a corporation's, I think, revenue is on over $100 million, and the ratio of CEA to mean employee pay is greater than 50 to 1, they pay a higher tax than they would otherwise pay. Does this have a chance in hell of getting through Congress, even a Democratic Congress?
I don't think it has a chance in hell of getting through, and I'm not sure it would have that effect. In the 1990s, we had a similar bill saying CEO pay becomes above a certain amount. Companies can't deduct that extra amount, and that passed, that bill. And all corporations did is they just didn't deduct it, and it didn't make that big a difference. I think the key vehicle here are the institutional shareholders. Remember, institutional shareholders now own 60 to 70% of the stock of most S&P 500 companies. And if they got together and really pushed, not just on advisory resolutions, but said, hey, maybe we'll vote out some of these compensation committee board members at the next meeting if they don't get the message, that would really change things.
You know, even though Bob Pozen doesn't think it would work, there's some legislators on Beacon Hill, Shirley, you talk about, who are doing a variation on the Sanders approach. What's happening there?
Well, State Senator Jason Lewis has a very similar bill to Sanders. So does Erica Eiderhoven. And, you know, they want to, the bill isn't, you know, it's kind of going through Beacon Hill. I think Senator Lewis has proposed it in years before, and it hasn't really gone anywhere. But again, I think there's new momentum. I do think that, you know, any legislation in Washington is very hard to pass these days, but I do think the bill starts the conversation of what can government do to rein in CEO pay.
You know, Bob, you're a big transparency guy, and so am I. Are you a transparency guy as a matter of principle the public has a right to know, or do you buy into the notion that if the public does know, the likelihood of getting action somewhere in a regulatory agency, the Congress, or those institutional shareholders goes up? What's the motivation?
I believe in both. I'm for transparency as a matter of principle. And I also think if we don't have the right information, then the chances of our doing something aren't very good. That's why I've been working with the Council of Institutional Investors to try to get these compensation committee reports changed so that we can actually understand what they say. Just pick up one, and they're all, in every proxy statement, they're there. They're very hard to make heads or tails of. We want to know why they're paying the CEOs what they are, and what's their definition of company performance, and what's the linkage. And it's really hard to understand now.
I figured I'd just call you and you'd explain it to me, Bob. So before
I gotta tell you something, even I struggled to read them. I'm telling you, they're not easy reading.
I know that. Before you go, I only have a minute left, 30 seconds for each of you. The primary argument that I've heard through the years is, listen, you may have a point on some level, but we got to pay these kind of salaries to attract and retain this level of talent. Quickly, starting with you, Shirley, what's your response to that?
You know, what we're giving now is we're creating a dynasty of wealth. You know, CEO pay at 50 million, 100 million. Do people really need that much money? I mean, I can see paying someone 5 million, maybe 10 million, but really these pay packages where they're over 50 or 100 million or more, it's outrageous.
How about you, Bob? Last word.
I think that most CEOs would agree that if the company does very well, they should do well. But if the company doesn't do well, they shouldn't do very well. And that's the key problem here. As Shirley said, this was a bad year for workers, a bad year for revenue. And we, in most cases, didn't see CEO pay go down. CEOs dock themselves 20% of their salary, but their salary is a small portion of their total comp. So I think we really need to make sure that if things don't go well, CEOs' pay goes down as much as it goes up in good times. It just got to be symmetrical.
I think that too. Bob Pozen, Shirley Leung, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.